The darkness was absolute that night, with no stars visible and no moon to guide them, just the low rumble of turbines mixing with the smell of salt spray and gun oil as Commander Edwin Wilkinson gripped the railing of USS O'Bannon's bridge, his knuckles white despite the warmth of the October night. Somewhere out there in the black void of Iron Bottom Sound, Japanese destroyers were racing south on what the Americans called the Tokyo Express, or Rat Run, delivering reinforcements to Guadalcanal, while American Marines fought and died on that godforsaken island. And tonight, O'Bannon was hunting them. It was 1:48 a.m. on October 13, 1942, and the war was 10 months old, though America was losing despite what the newspapers back home might claim. Because here in the South Pacific, where men actually fought, the truth was impossible to hide. Japanese forces controlled most of the region with better trained troops and superior equipment, their naval doctrine perfected through years of combat in China, proving devastatingly effective against American forces that seemed outmatched at every turn. American destroyers had been outfought, outmaneuvered, and outsmarted in nearly every engagement, and the waters around Guadalcanal had earned their grim nickname honestly as Iron Bottom Sound, where dozens of American ships rested on the seafloor 2 miles down with their crews still inside. Wilkinson knew the statistics because everyone did, having watched as the U.S. Navy lost 2 aircraft carriers, 7 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 14 destroyers in just the 6 months since Marines landed on Guadalcanal, while Japanese losses remained significantly lighter. Their destroyers seemed particularly invincible at night, moving fast and aggressive with the long lance torpedo that was simply the finest torpedo in the world, teaching American captains to fear those night engagements where sudden flashes of torpedoes in the water preceded catastrophic explosions and ships sinking in minutes. But tonight was different because O'Bannon was no ordinary destroyer, having been commissioned just 3 months earlier from Bath Iron Works in Maine as a Fletcher-class destroyer with hull number DD-450, representing something the U.S. Navy desperately needed in this grinding war of attrition. At 1:52 a.m., the radar operator's voice crackled over the intercom with the words that every destroyer captain both dreaded and anticipated, reporting multiple surface contacts bearing 170 at 16,000 yards with a count of 6 targets, making 30 knots on course 140. Wilkinson's response was immediate and decisive as he ordered general quarters and all hands to battle stations, with gun crews standing by and torpedo mounts preparing to launch while all engines went ahead flank speed, the alarms screaming throughout the ship as men scrambled to their positions. Throughout O'Bannon, 329 men transformed the ship from a cruising warship into a fighting machine in less than 3 minutes, with gun crews rushing to their mounts and damage control parties sealing hatches while engineers pushed the turbines to maximum power. Most of these men barely 20 years old, and half having never seen combat or even been to sea before joining the Navy 6 months ago. The Japanese force was closing fast, and Wilkinson could see them through his binoculars as 6 Fubuki-class destroyers, older designs from the early 1930s that weren't as large as O'Bannon or as well-armed but were crewed by veterans who'd fought at Pearl Harbor, at Java Sea, at Savo Island, men who knew how to win night battles against American ships. The range closed to 10,000 yards, then 8,000, then 6,000, as the Japanese destroyers maintained their formation with professional discipline, having spotted the American ships and beginning to maneuver in preparation for launching their torpedoes. The Long Lance had a range of 20,000 yards, meaning at this distance the Japanese could fire with impunity and let their torpedoes do the killing while staying out of gun range, a standard doctrine that had worked repeatedly in previous engagements and should work again tonight. But O'Bannon possessed something the Japanese didn't expect in the form of radar fire control, with her 5-inch guns aimed not by optical sights struggling in the darkness, but by electronics and computers that could track targets, calculate lead angles, compensate for ship movement, and deliver shells with accuracy that human gunners simply couldn't match in these conditions. At 2:03 a.m., Wilkinson gave the order for all guns to commence firing, and the night exploded with 5-inch guns roaring simultaneously in a deafening blast, the muzzle flash blinding anyone looking directly at them while the ship shuddered with recoil. 5 seconds later, the guns fired again, and then again, and then again in a rhythm of 15 rounds per minute per gun, totaling 75 shells per minute, all radar-directed, and all terrifyingly accurate as they streaked toward the Japanese formation. The lead Japanese destroyer took 3 hits in the first salvo, with the bridge disintegrating and the captain, Commander Yoshio Suzuki, a veteran of 20 night battles, killed instantly before the second salvo hit the same ship's forward magazine. The explosion was visible even at 6,000 yards, as a brilliant orange flash followed by darkness. The destroyer gone and sunk in less than 30 seconds, with all hands lost. The second Japanese destroyer turned hard to port in a desperate attempt to evade the suddenly deadly American gunfire. But O'Bannon's guns tracked smoothly with computerized precision, compensating and adjusting until the next salvo hit amidships and penetrated the engine room. High explosive shells detonated inside the machinery spaces, rupturing steam lines and exploding boilers until the destroyer slowed and stopped, dead in the water and doomed. 3 minutes into the battle, O'Bannon had crippled 2 enemy destroyers, while the other 4 Japanese ships broke formation in confusion, turning away and launching torpedoes blindly into the darkness in hopes of lucky hits that never came, their torpedoes passing harmlessly astern of the American formation. The long lance, so feared in previous battles, proved useless without accurate targeting, and now the American destroyers pressed forward as O'Bannon, Nicholas, Radford, and Fletcher herself worked in coordination, their radar-directed guns systematically targeting the retreating Japanese force in what became not a battle, but a slaughter. A third Japanese destroyer took hits to the stern and lost steering, circling helplessly until another salvo broke her back and she sank in 4 minutes, while by 2:18 a.m., just 15 minutes after the first shot, 3 Japanese destroyers rested on the bottom with 2 retreating north at maximum speed and 1 burning dead in the water as her crew abandoned ship. They jumped into oil-slicked water, knowing they'd likely never be rescued, knowing that Iron Bottom Sound would become their grave too, joining the hundreds of other sailors already entombed in the depths. American losses amounted to 0 ships sunk, with USS Fletcher having taken 1 hit from a 5-inch shell that failed to explode, and USS Nicholas reporting superficial damage from shell fragments. Total casualties standing at just 14 men wounded, with none killed. Japanese losses told a different story entirely, with 3 destroyers sunk and 1,124 men dead, a casualty ratio so one-sided it seemed impossible. Commander Wilkinson stood on O'Bannon's bridge, watching the burning wrecks and survivors in the water, oil slicks spreading across the dark surface, and he felt no triumph or satisfaction, but only relief that his ship remained intact and his crew alive with the mission accomplished. He keyed the intercom to tell his men they'd done excellent shooting before ordering them to secure from general quarters and resume patrol, staying alert because there might be more enemy ships out there in the darkness. What Wilkinson couldn't know in that moment was that this battle represented a turning point, not just in the Guadalcanal campaign, but in the entire Pacific War. Because O'Bannon wasn't unique or a prototype or an experiment, but rather one of 175 Fletcher-class destroyers that would be built over the next 3 years. 175 ships, all identical and all equally capable, all about to change the balance of naval power in the Pacific in ways that would prove decisive for the outcome of the war. The Fletcher-class wasn't born from innovation or technological breakthrough, but from desperation, from the stark realization that America's pre-war destroyer force was catastrophically inadequate for the war everyone knew was coming. In 1940, the US Navy possessed 171 destroyers, which on paper sounded impressive and substantial and sufficient for any mission. But the reality proved far grimmer when examined closely. Most of those destroyers were relics from World War I. The old four-stackers and flush-deckers built in 1918 and 1919, making them 22 years old by 1940 and thoroughly obsolete, too slow and underarmed and barely capable of convoy escort duty, completely unsuitable for modern naval warfare against capable opponents. The newer destroyers, like the Benson-class and Gleaves-class, represented better designs with modern capabilities. But only 64 such ships existed, while war approached with terrible inevitability. Everyone in the Navy Department understood that Germany had conquered most of Europe, and Japan was advancing through China, while Britain fought desperately for survival, making America's entry into the war not a question of if, but merely of when. When war came, 64 modern destroyers wouldn't be nearly enough to meet the Navy's needs across 2 oceans and countless missions. The Navy needed destroyers for everything imaginable in modern warfare, from fleet escort to anti-submarine patrol, from convoy protection to shore bombardment, from mine-laying to rescue operations, from radar picket duty to amphibious assault support, with destroyers serving as the workhorses that did every mission every day, everywhere. Without sufficient destroyers, the Navy couldn't function effectively or project power globally, or protect vital convoys, or support invasions, or ultimately win the war that was coming. Captain Robert Smith understood this reality better than anyone as head of the Bureau of Ships Destroyer Section, having spent years studying destroyer design and analyzing combat reports from the European War, while examining Japanese destroyer development to learn what worked and what didn't. In early 1940, he received an impossible assignment to design a destroyer that could do everything while being mass-produced quickly and not becoming obsolete halfway through construction, remaining relevant even when the war ended. However many years in the future that might be. Smith's team worked through 1940 and into 1941, with long hours and endless meetings, debating every detail and specification and trade-off while examining previous destroyer designs from Britain, Japan, Germany, Italy, and France, looking for ideas and mistakes to avoid. They studied combat reports from the Battle of the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Channel, learning what worked in actual combat versus what merely looked impressive on paper. And slowly, the design took shape. The result emerged in early 1941 with the design designation DD-445 class, named for Admiral Frank Friday Fletcher, who'd received the Medal of Honor during the 1914 Veracruz incident. And the Fletcher class proved revolutionary, not because of any single innovative feature, but because of how everything integrated together. Every system worked in harmony with every other system, and the ship balanced speed, firepower, protection, range, and survivability in ways no previous destroyer had managed to achieve, creating a platform that would prove decisive in the coming war. The specifications impressed naval architects and officers alike, with displacement at 2,100 tons standard load and 2,700 tons at full load, making the ships larger than previous American destroyers. at 376 feet in length with a 39-foot beam and 18-foot draft. The Fletchers were big enough to handle rough seas and carry sufficient fuel for long-range operations while mounting serious weapons that could threaten any enemy vessel. Propulsion was straightforward but powerful, using 2 steam turbines generating 60,000 combined shaft horsepower through 4 boilers driving 2 shafts, producing a maximum speed of 38 knots sustained with over 40 knots possible in short sprints. This made the Fletchers fast enough to catch any enemy destroyer while being able to escape any enemy battleship, and the range of 6,500 nautical miles at 15 knots meant they could cross the Pacific and conduct extended operations without constant refueling. But speed and range meant nothing without weapons to fight with, so the Fletcher-class mounted 5 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, with that 5th gun providing better weight of fire and coverage and redundancy if guns were damaged compared to the 4-gun layouts of previous classes. These weren't ordinary 5-inch guns, but dual-purpose weapons capable of engaging surface targets at 18,000 yards maximum range or aircraft at 37,000 feet maximum elevation, meaning one gun type could handle 2 different missions while simplifying logistics and training requirements. The fire control systems represented truly revolutionary technology, with each gun mount connected to a Mark 37 fire control director that used radar guidance and computer assistance to track targets and calculate lead angles while compensating for ship movement, wind, temperature, and barrel wear. Human gunners provided input while computers refined their calculations, producing accuracy that optical sights simply couldn't match regardless of whether operations occurred in daylight, darkness, or any weather conditions, giving American destroyers a decisive advantage over enemy ships still relying on optical fire control. Torpedoes remained essential weapons despite the emphasis on guns, with the Fletcher-class mounting 10 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple mounts on port and starboard, armed with Mark 15 torpedoes that could reach 15,000 yards at high speed of 26.5 knots. While not as capable as Japanese long-lance torpedoes in terms of range and speed, American torpedoes worked reliably, without the magnetic detonator failures that had plagued early war submarine weapons, meaning they hit their targets and exploded and accomplished their mission consistently. Anti-aircraft armament was extensive from the start and would grow even more formidable as the war progressed, initially mounting 7 40mm Bofors guns and 20 20mm Oerlikon cannons, plus the 5 5-inch guns that could engage aircraft, meaning a Fletcher at full anti-aircraft alert could fire 1,500 rounds per minute. The sky around the ship became a wall of steel through which suicide aircraft, conventional bombers, and torpedo planes had to fly, with most never reaching their targets. Depth charge equipment provided comprehensive anti-submarine capability through 2 racks at the stern and 6 K-gun throwers amidships, allowing Fletchers to hunt submarines, kill submarines, and protect convoys from submarine attack using equipment that wasn't revolutionary but proved effective, proven, and reliable in actual combat operations. Electronic systems represented state-of-the-art technology with multiple radar sets for surface search, air search, and fire control, all integrated to provide continuous information to the bridge so the captain knew where every surface contact was, every air contact, every threat, regardless of darkness, fog, or rain. Radar gave American destroyers eyes that saw everything, while Japanese destroyers lacking equivalent systems were comparatively blind, creating an asymmetric advantage that proved decisive in countless engagements. Sonar systems featured advanced technology with better resolution, better range, and better target discrimination than previous classes. making submarine detection more reliable and effective, since submarines represented the greatest threat to American shipping and every convoy needed escorts with capable sonar. Radio equipment was equally impressive, with multiple frequencies, encrypted communications, and links to fleet command, enabling the coordination that was essential in modern naval warfare, where ships needed to communicate, share information, and execute complex maneuvers together. The crew complement of 329 men, consisting of 15 officers and 314 enlisted personnel, was larger than previous destroyer crews, but necessary for operating all these systems effectively. Gun crews, torpedo crews, radar operators, sonar operators, radio operators, damage control parties, engineers, cooks, and medics all had multiple roles and trained on multiple systems, so if crew members were killed, others could fill in, providing redundancy and survivability that was essential for ships that would fight prolonged campaigns far from home ports. The design received approval in June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor and 6 months before America officially entered the war, though everyone understood war was inevitable and coming soon. The design was immediately sent to shipyards, with contracts awarded and materials ordered as construction began. The first keel being laid on October 2, 1941, for USS Fletcher, DD-445, the namesake ship and first of many. Production was organized brilliantly across not one shipyard or two, but 11 facilities spread across the entire country, including Bath Iron Works in Maine, Bethlehem Steel in Staten Island, Consolidated Steel in Orange, Texas, Federal Shipbuilding in Kearney, New Jersey, Gulf Shipbuilding in Chickasaw, Alabama, Charleston, Navy Yard in Boston, Mare Island, Navy Yard in California, and Puget Sound, Navy Yard in Washington. Every major shipyard capable of building destroyers received contracts, and every shipyard built Fletchers simultaneously, with competition between yards, driving efficiency as each wanted to launch ships faster and build them better than the others. The production rate proved staggering, with USS Fletcher commissioning June 30, 1942, followed by USS Radford on July 22nd, USS Jenkins on July 31st, and USS O'Bannon on July 26th, putting 4 ships in commission in just 1 month. The pace accelerated dramatically, with 24 Fletchers in commission by December 1942, 105 by December 1943, 158 by December 1944, and a final total of 175 by war's end, meaning 175 destroyers were built in less than 4 years at an average of 1 every 8 days. This represented the greatest naval shipbuilding program in history, exceeding anything Britain, Germany, or Japan produced, and delivering more destroyers than the entire Royal Navy possessed in 1939. Yet the quality never declined despite the incredible pace. Every Fletcher was built to identical specifications, using the same blueprints, the same systems, and the same weapons, creating standardization that meant parts were interchangeable. Training was universal, and doctrine was consistent, allowing a sailor trained on USS Fletcher to transfer to USS O'Bannon and know every system, every procedure, and every station without any retraining required. This standardization revolutionized naval operations because crews could be rotated between ships. Damaged vessels could be cannibalized for parts to repair others. Combat lessons learned on one Fletcher were immediately applicable to all Fletchers, and tactics developed by one captain could be adopted fleet-wide. The Fletcher-class wasn't just 175 individual ships, but rather a system, a fleet within the fleet, a standardized combat platform that could be deployed anywhere, anytime, for any mission with predictable and reliable results. Building ships represented only the first challenge, while making them fight effectively proved much harder, because the men crewing these destroyers weren't professional sailors or Naval Academy graduates with years of training, but rather civilians, draftees, and volunteers, young men averaging 21 years old who'd been farmers, mechanics, students, and factory workers just months before. Most had never seen the ocean, never been on a ship, never fired a gun. Yet now, they were expected to operate complex weapon systems, fight experienced enemy forces, and win battles against Japanese naval veterans who'd been training for years. The training program was intense, starting with boot camp at Great Lakes or San Diego for 8 weeks covering basic seamanship, naval discipline, physical conditioning, and weapons familiarization before moving to specialized schools. Gunners' mates learned fire control systems, while radar operators learned electronics, and sonar operators learned submarine detection, as engine room crews learned turbine operations and damage control parties learned firefighting, flood control, and emergency repairs, with everyone learning everything through mandatory cross-training, because in-combat casualties were inevitable and dead crewmen needed immediate replacement by whoever was available. After specialized training lasting another 8 to 12 weeks, the men reported to their assigned ships for more training on ship-specific systems through combat drills, damage control exercises, gunnery practice, live fire exercises, and coordination drills repeated over and over until reactions became automatic and every man knew his job instinctively, transforming the crew into a single functioning organism. The captains proved crucial to success, with most being pre-war Navy officers and academy graduates who'd served on older destroyers and understood naval warfare, tactics, and how to fight, though many were young commanders rather than senior captains. Men in their early 30s given command of 300 men and a $25 million warship with expectations to fight, win, and survive. The responsibility was crushing, with casualty rates among destroyer captains ranking among the highest in the Navy. Yet these men accepted the burden, led their crews, and fought their ships with varying degrees of success, as some performed brilliantly, some adequately, and a few failed, though most rose to the challenge. The Fletcher-class entered combat in mid-1942, with the first ships arriving in the Pacific during July and August, just as the Guadalcanal campaign was starting, and just when the Navy needed them most desperately, proving themselves immediately in dozens of night battles around Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and Bougainville. The Tokyo Express, which had previously seemed unstoppable, suddenly faced American destroyers that could fight back effectively, hit targets in darkness with radar, survive torpedo attacks through maneuver, and win engagements through superior technology and training. USS Fletcher herself fought at Cape Esperance in October 1942 during a night surface action where Japanese cruisers and destroyers attempted to bombard Henderson Field but were intercepted by American cruisers and destroyers in a chaotic engagement featuring radar-directed gunfire and torpedoes launched at close range. Fletcher engaged multiple targets and fired over 400 5-inch shells, claiming hits on at least 2 Japanese destroyers while surviving without serious damage, teaching her crew what combat really meant and what Fletcher-class capabilities could actually accomplish in real battle conditions. Other Fletchers had similar experiences that validated the design, with USS Nicholas fighting at Kula Gulf in July 1943 during a night torpedo action at close range where she fired all 10 torpedoes and claimed 3 hits, resulting in 2 Japanese destroyers sinking, while Nicholas took damage from 1 shell hit that killed 6 men, but survived to return to base, be repaired, and return to action within weeks. This pattern repeated across the Pacific as Fletchers fought, took damage, survived, were repaired, and fought again in a cycle that demonstrated the class's fundamental resilience and effectiveness. The Fletcher-class advantage wasn't invincibility, because these weren't superweapons immune to damage, but rather well-designed ships that could be damaged and could be sunk. With 19 Fletchers eventually lost to enemy action from torpedoes, bombs, kamikaze attacks, naval gunfire, and mines. They were ships made of steel and thus vulnerable to weapons. Yet their survival rate proved extraordinary, with 85% of Fletchers surviving the war compared to other destroyer classes like the British Tribal class with 56% survival, the Japanese Fubuki class with 13% survival, and the German type 1936 with 14% survival, making the Fletcher's 85% survival rate overwhelming evidence of superior design, construction quality, damage control, redundant systems, watertight integrity, and training. Consider USS Laffey, technically a Sumner-class destroyer that was a Fletcher derivative with 6 5-inch guns instead of 5, but essentially the same fundamental design, which on April 16, 1945, off Okinawa, was performing radar picket duty to detect incoming Japanese aircraft and provide early warning in what amounted to a suicide mission. The Japanese sent 50 kamikaze aircraft targeting the radar picket destroyers, attacking Laffey continuously for 80 minutes as 22 kamikaze aircraft dove at her while she shot down 9 with guns firing constantly, her 40mm Bofors, 20mm Oerlikons, and 5-inch guns with proximity-fused shells all blazing away as the crew fought with desperate intensity, knowing their lives depended on keeping those kamikazes away from their ship. But 13 kamikazes got through those defenses and hit Laffey along with 4 conventional bombs from dive bombers, totaling 17 hits in 80 minutes that devastated the ship with fires everywhere. 59 men killed, over 70 wounded, gun mounts destroyed, the bridge damaged, radar, antennas shattered, the rudder jammed, and 1 engine room flooded. Any other destroyer, indeed any other ship, would have sunk and should have sunk under such punishment. But Laffey didn't, because her damage control parties fought the fires, sealed the flooding, and stabilized the ship, allowing her to survive and limp back to port, where she was repaired and returned to service before the war ended. Her survival serving as testament to Fletcher-class construction, damage control training, crew determination, and design excellence. 36 Fletchers were hit by kamikazes during the Okinawa campaign, with only 3 sinking, producing a 92% survival rate against suicide aircraft loaded with high explosives and diving at hundreds of miles per hour, an unprecedented achievement that no other ship class could match under similar circumstances. The statistics tell a compelling story of Fletcher-class success, with 175 ships built and commissioned, all seeing combat and all fighting in the Pacific, while some also fought in the Atlantic escorting convoys, hunting U-boats, and supporting invasions, though the Pacific remained where Fletchers proved most decisive. Enemy ships sunk by Fletchers totaled 29 warships, including destroyers, cruisers, and submarines, as confirmed kills, plus another 38 submarines destroyed and 47 transports and cargo ships sent to the bottom, while aircraft shot down reached 437, confirmed with hundreds more probably destroyed or damaged. Shore bombardment missions numbered in the thousands, with every amphibious landing from 1943 to 1945, involving Fletchers providing fire support, while convoy escort missions reached tens of thousands as these ships protected the logistics that kept the entire war effort moving forward. Rescue operations saved thousands of downed pilots, shipwrecked sailors, and Marines trapped on beaches under fire, demonstrating that one ship class was doing everything everywhere for 3 years from Guadalcanal in 1942 to Tokyo Bay in 1945, fighting in every major campaign, every major battle, and every major operation. Fletchers became the backbone of the Pacific Fleet as the ships that made everything else possible, because carriers needed escorts, and battleships needed screens, and amphibious assaults needed fire support, and supply convoys needed protection, with all these missions requiring destroyers. America had 175 excellent destroyers that were all identical, all capable, and all ready to fight, giving the Navy a decisive advantage in flexibility and numbers that the Japanese simply couldn't match. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, understood this better than anyone and told war correspondents in 1944 that the Fletcher-class destroyer was the best investment the Navy ever made, because for the cost of one Iowa-class battleship, America built 16 Fletchers, and those 16 Fletchers contributed more to victory than any battleship ever could. Battleships were impressive and powerful, but Fletchers were essential, and while America could have won the war without battleships, victory without Fletchers would have been impossible. He was absolutely right, because battleships fought in only a handful of surface actions consisting of dramatic engagements and impressive gunnery duels that were nonetheless rare, with most battleships spending most of the war escorting carriers and providing anti-aircraft protection and supporting amphibious landings in useful but not decisive roles. Fletchers, by contrast, fought every day and every night in every mission, being everywhere and doing everything while winning consistently, decisively, and repeatedly in ways that proved strategically vital. The post-war fate of the Fletcher-class proves remarkable because most warships are scrapped when wars end, being too expensive to maintain and obsolete and no longer needed. Yet Fletchers continued serving with 62 remaining in U.S. Navy commission through the 1960s. They fought in Korea, providing shore bombardment and escorting carriers and hunting submarines in the same missions they'd performed in World War II. And they performed these missions competently because the Fletcher-class design was timeless, not tied to specific technologies that became obsolete or dependent on tactics that changed, but rather representing good, solid, capable warships that could adapt to new missions and new threats. 19 Fletchers were transferred to Allied navies after the war, with Greece receiving 4, Turkey receiving 2, South Korea receiving 3, Italy receiving 2, West Germany receiving 4, Spain receiving 2, Argentina receiving 1, and Chile receiving 1. And these ships served for decades, with some remaining in service into the 1990s, 50 years after they were built. They were modernized with upgraded radar systems and new weapons and anti-submarine rocket launchers and helicopter facilities. But the basic hull remained the same as the 1941 design, still relevant and still capable and still effective half a century later in ways that demonstrated the fundamental soundness of the original concept. The last Fletcher in U.S. Navy service was USS Richard B. Anderson, which was decommissioned in 1971, 29 years after the first Fletcher was commissioned, representing 29 years of continuous service through World War II, through Korea, and through the Cold War in a record of longevity that no other destroyer class could match. Today, only 2 Fletchers survive as USS Kidd in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and USS Cassin Young in Boston, Massachusetts, both preserved as museum ships in 1940s configuration, where visitors can tour them and walk the decks and see the cramped quarters, the gun mounts, the torpedo tubes, the radar equipment, and the bridge where commanders stood and fought their ships, perhaps beginning to understand why these ships mattered, and why they were special and why they won. There's a story, probably apocryphal, but capturing essential truth, about a conversation at the Navy Department in 1946, where Admiral Ernest King, who served as Chief of Naval Operations throughout the war, was reviewing the war's lessons when a junior officer asked him what decision he would change if he could go back to 1940. King allegedly thought for a long moment before saying he'd order more Fletchers, that America built 175 but should have built 300 or 400, cutting every other program including battleships, heavy cruisers, and even some carriers to redirect all those resources to Fletchers. The officer protested that America had won, so why would more destroyers have been necessary? And King responded that every Fletcher saved American lives and sank enemy ships and completed missions with no other ship type having that record, and no other class being as versatile, as reliable, or as survivable. If he had to fight the Pacific War again, with any fleet composition he wanted, he'd choose 600 Fletchers and absolutely nothing else. Not one battleship and not one carrier, just Fletchers. The officer questioned how they could fight without carriers, since carriers won the war. But King explained that carriers sank enemy ships in impressive and decisive ways, but carriers needed escorts which Fletchers provided, and carriers needed screens against submarines which Fletchers provided, and carriers needed rescued pilots when aircraft were shot down, which Fletchers accomplished. The Fletcher-class didn't need other ships to function effectively, but other ships needed Fletchers to survive and operate, and that's the difference between a weapon system and a strategic enabler, with Fletchers enabling everything else. Whether King actually said this remains unclear, but the sentiment reflects reality, because the Fletcher-class destroyer was the most important ship type of the Pacific War. Not the most glamorous or the most powerful or the one that generated headlines, but the most essential ship that made victory possible against determined and capable enemies. October 13, 1942. Iron Bottom Sound, 2:47 a.m., and USS O'Bannon resumes patrol with the battle over and 3 Japanese destroyers sinking while 2 flee north and American ships remain intact, the Tokyo Express having been stopped again, as it had been stopped before and would be stopped again. Commander Wilkinson writes in the deck log that they engaged enemy destroyers with 3 confirmed sinks and 0 damage to O'Bannon, noting that the crew performed excellently and the ship performed flawlessly before resuming patrol station. It's a routine entry, matter-of-fact and understated, because for O'Bannon and for all the Fletcher-class destroyers, this is routine. This is what they do by fighting and winning and surviving and moving to the next mission, without drama or reflection on what the battle means. In October 1942, nobody knows what it means or understands that this battle represents a turning point, where American destroyers can finally fight Japanese destroyers on equal terms, where the technological advantage Japan enjoyed for the first year of war is gone, where from this point forward, American destroyers will dominate night battles and win surface actions and control the seas around the Solomon Islands and eventually across the entire Pacific. O'Bannon will continue fighting for 3 more years through 37 major engagements and dozens of smaller actions, sinking 1 submarine and shooting down 9 aircraft, and bombarding 14 islands and rescuing 117 survivors from sinking ships and downed aircraft, never being seriously damaged in combat, and never losing more than 5 crewmen in any single action. She'll earn 17 battle stars, more than almost any other American destroyer, and she'll survive the war and serve in Korea and be decommissioned in 1970 after 28 years of service to her country. But tonight, in October 1942, she's just doing her job by being a Fletcher-class destroyer, fighting the war and winning the battles and protecting American forces and killing enemy ships and surviving. Because that's what Fletchers do, and they did it 175 times over in every battle and every campaign and every theater from Guadalcanal to Okinawa from 1942 to 1945. The diversity of Fletcher-class operations proved staggering in scope and complexity, with these ships serving not as specialized vessels designed for one specific mission, but as multi-role platforms capable of adapting to whatever the Navy needed at any given moment, whether that meant surface combat or submarine hunting or shore bombardment or radar picket duty or rescue operations. Always the same ships and the same crews, but different missions every week. This versatility was intentional from the beginning, with Captain Smith's design team understanding that modern naval warfare required flexible platforms capable of doing many things adequately rather than one thing superbly. Because in war, you couldn't predict what you'd need tomorrow or plan for every contingency, but needed ships that could adapt and improvise and overcome unexpected challenges as they arose. The range of Fletcher accomplishments extended far beyond simple statistics of ships sunk and aircraft destroyed, encompassing the entire spectrum of naval operations in ways that demonstrated the fundamental soundness of the design concept and the skill of the men who operated these remarkable vessels. From the frozen waters of the Aleutians to the tropical heat of the South Pacific, from the relatively calm waters of the Philippine Sea to the typhoon-ravaged approaches to Okinawa, Fletchers operated in every environment and under every condition imaginable, adapting to whatever nature and enemy action threw at them, while maintaining remarkable levels of operational effectiveness that astounded even their most optimistic proponents. The logistical achievement represented by the Fletcher-class program deserves recognition equal to the combat achievements, because building 175 destroyers in 4 years required coordination and planning and resource allocation on a scale never before attempted in naval history. The shipyards had to be organized and workers trained and materials sourced and transportation arranged to move components from factories scattered across America to assembly yards on both coasts, creating a supply chain of staggering complexity that somehow functioned with remarkable efficiency despite the chaos of wartime production and constant changes in priorities and specifications. Each Fletcher required approximately 12,000 tons of steel, with that steel coming from mills in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, processed into plates and beams and fittings by factories across the industrial heartland before being shipped to coastal yards for assembly. The propulsion systems came from specialized manufacturers, with turbines from General Electric or Westinghouse, boilers from Babcock and Wilcox or Foster Wheeler, reduction gears from Philadelphia Gearworks, each component manufactured to precise specifications and requiring skilled workers to assemble and test before installation in the hull. The electronics represented cutting-edge technology requiring specialized components that didn't exist in large quantities before the war, with radar systems and sonar equipment and radio gear all needing to be manufactured in sufficient numbers to equip not just Fletchers, but every other warship being built simultaneously. The commitment of resources to destroyer construction was enormous, with each Fletcher costing approximately $6 million in 1942 currency, meaning the total program cost exceeded $1 billion at a time when the entire federal budget was measured in tens of billions. The human investment matched the financial commitment, with each Fletcher requiring a crew of 329 men who needed to be recruited, trained, equipped, and sustained throughout their service, meaning that keeping 175 Fletchers operational required maintaining a personnel pool of over 57,000 sailors at any given time. These men needed food and clothing and medical care and pay and mail from home and recreation when in port, and 1,000 other things that made naval service possible, creating logistical demands that extended far beyond the ships themselves. The training infrastructure expanded dramatically to meet Fletcher-class needs, with new schools established and existing facilities expanded to handle the flood of recruits needing specialized training in radar operation, sonar analysis, fire control computation, damage control techniques, and every other skill required for modern destroyer operations. The Navy created standardized training courses, ensuring that every radar operator learned the same procedures. Every gunner's mate understood the same systems. Every damage control specialist knew the same techniques, producing uniformity that made crew transfers between ships possible and allowed rapid replacement of casualties without degrading operational effectiveness. The maintenance and repair infrastructure grew equally large, with bases established across the Pacific to provide everything from minor repairs to major overhauls, creating a network of facilities that could sustain Fletcher operations thousands of miles from American shipyards. Forward bases at Pearl Harbor, Espiritu Santo, Manus, Ulithi, and Okinawa developed capabilities to repair battle damage, replace worn machinery, replenish ammunition and fuel, and provide crews with rest and recreation before sending them back into combat. The spare parts supply system represented a logistics triumph, ensuring that critical components remained available when needed despite the vast distances involved and the unpredictability of combat damage. With warehouses stocking thousands of different parts, from fire control computers to boiler tubes to radar antennas. The standardization of the Fletcher-class made this supply system manageable because the same parts fit every ship, meaning inventory could be consolidated and distribution simplified compared to supporting multiple different destroyer classes with unique components. The fuel requirements were substantial, with each Fletcher burning approximately 60 tons of fuel oil per day at cruising speed, meaning that keeping 175 Fletchers operating required over 10,000 tons of fuel daily, necessitating a vast tanker fleet to transport oil from refineries in California and Texas to bases across the Pacific. The ammunition requirements were equally demanding, with each Fletcher carrying approximately 600 5-inch shells, 4,000 rounds of 40mm ammunition, and 10,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition, all of which needed to be manufactured, transported, stored, and loaded aboard ships in combat zones thousands of miles from American factories. The personnel rotation system developed to sustain Fletcher operations over multiple years of combat proved essential to maintaining crew effectiveness because men couldn't fight continuously without rest, and combat fatigue degraded performance and increased casualties. The Navy implemented rotation policies allowing crews to serve 12 to 18 months in combat zones before returning to the United States for leave and reassignment to new construction or training duties, ensuring that experienced personnel could train new crews while preventing complete psychological breakdown from prolonged exposure to combat stress. The medical support system grew in sophistication as the war progressed, with each Fletcher carrying a medical officer and several corpsmen capable of treating injuries and illness aboard ship, while larger hospital, ships, and shore facilities provided more extensive care for seriously wounded personnel. The Navy learned to treat combat trauma, both physical and psychological, developing procedures for managing burns, blast injuries, shrapnel wounds, and the psychological effects of prolonged combat exposure, saving thousands of lives that would have been lost in earlier wars. The communication networks linking Fletchers to higher command and to each other represented technological achievements that enabled coordinated operations on unprecedented scales, with radio systems allowing real-time communication across thousands of miles and encrypted links preventing enemy interception of sensitive information. The Navy developed sophisticated communication procedures, ensuring that orders reached ships quickly and that combat reports flowed back to commanders who could adjust plans based on current intelligence. creating a level of operational coordination that would have been impossible just a decade earlier. The intelligence support provided to Fletcher operations improved dramatically throughout the war, with code-breaking successes allowing American commanders to anticipate Japanese movements and position forces accordingly, giving Fletcher's opportunities to intercept enemy convoys and reinforcement missions that might otherwise have reached their destinations safely. The integration of intelligence into operational planning represented a force multiplier that magnified Fletcher effectiveness beyond what raw combat capabilities alone could achieve. The adaptation of Fletcher-class tactics to meet evolving threats demonstrated the flexibility built into the design and the competence of the officers commanding these ships, because what worked against Japanese destroyers in 1942 didn't necessarily work against kamikaze aircraft in 1945, requiring continuous evolution of doctrine and procedures. The Navy developed specialized tactics for radar picket duty, for shore bombardment, for anti-submarine operations, for convoy escort, for fleet screening, ensuring that Fletchers could perform every mission with maximum effectiveness while minimizing losses. The role of Fletcher-class destroyers in the broader context of American naval strategy cannot be overstated, because these ships enabled operations that would have been impossible without them. From the Carrier Task Force, operations that destroyed Japanese naval aviation, to the amphibious campaigns that seized island bases across the Pacific, to the blockade operations that strangled Japanese commerce and industry. Fletchers were everywhere doing everything, the indispensable workhorses without which the more glamorous capital ships couldn't have operated safely or effectively. The legacy of the Fletcher class extends beyond the Second World War into the decades that followed, influencing destroyer design worldwide and establishing principles of multi-role capability, redundant systems, and crew survivability that remain relevant in modern warship construction. Naval architects studying Fletcher operations learned valuable lessons about what worked and what didn't, informing the development of post-war destroyer classes and eventually the guided missile destroyers that succeeded them. The human stories embedded in Fletcher operations deserve remembrance beyond simple statistics, because these ships were more than steel and machinery, but rather communities of young men far from home, facing death daily while maintaining professional performance under conditions of extreme stress, forming bonds of friendship and trust that lasted lifetimes and creating memories both terrible and precious that shaped the rest of their lives. The Fletcher veterans who survived carried their experiences forward into peace, contributing to their communities and their nation in ways both visible and invisible. Their service during the war forming foundations for productive civilian lives afterward. The Fletcher-class miracle wasn't primarily technological or industrial, but rather human, representing the ability of a democratic society to mobilize its resources and its people for a common purpose, to design and build and operate complex weapon systems while maintaining focus on ultimate objectives of defeating tyranny and preserving freedom. The Fletcher-class program demonstrated that America could match and exceed the industrial and military capabilities of any adversary when properly motivated and organized, turning potential into reality through sustained effort and sacrifice over years of grueling combat. The lessons of Fletcher-class operations remain relevant for modern naval forces facing different threats in different environments, because the fundamental principles of flexibility, reliability, crew competence, and systemic resilience transcend specific technologies and tactical situations, representing enduring truths about effective naval warfare that apply regardless of whether ships carry guns or missiles, use steam turbines or gas turbines, navigate by stars or satellites. The Fletcher class showed what was possible when good design met adequate resources and competent leadership, creating a benchmark against which subsequent destroyer programs have been measured and often found wanting. The Fletcher-class story represents one of the great achievements of the Second World War, a program that succeeded beyond its designer's most optimistic projections and contributed decisively to victory in the Pacific, while establishing standards of excellence that influenced naval architecture for generations. These ships and the men who sailed them deserve remembrance not just for what they accomplished during the war, but for what they represented about American capabilities and American values, demonstrating that democracy could fight effectively and win decisively when its survival and its principles were threatened, representing the Fletcher-class miracle of one design that was mass-produced and standardized and deployed everywhere, winning the Pacific one battle at a time and one mission at a time and one ship at a time, until victory was achieved and the war was won and peace was finally restored to a world that had known too much suffering and too much death for too many years.